The effect the American Revolution had on Native peoples is hard to overestimate. To begin to understand their experience, one needs to look at the seminal event that led up to it, the Seven Years' War, as well as reflect on how the traditional Native life fit into the landscape of the new America. For the British and the French, it meant control over the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, modern-day Pittsburgh, and the control of the Ohio Valley. For the Native people involved in the fighting, either for the British or the French, it was a new kind of warfare. It was a war fought without honor and against an enemy they did not understand. Prior to the Seven Years' War, the Indians had made trade alliances with the French west of the Appalachian Mountains. The native tribes of the eastern seaboard had moved into the Ohio Valley, still unclaimed by Britain or France, from their traditional lands to the east, after colonial settlement began encroaching westward. This demographic shift was a stark change for some, and in particular the Delaware and Shawnee. Many of them had moved into the Ohio Valley, not as a cohesive tribal unit, but as smaller individual family bands. They formed multi-ethnic villages in lands sparsely populated, but still within the Iroquois hunting territory. They were searching for a collective tribal unity consisting of many bands to try to defend their way of life from the foreboding threat that the colonists brought. The Iroquois claimed the lands of the Ohio Valley as theirs. The British claimed that as subjects of the king, the land was ultimately theirs. In 1754, when British soldiers were sent to the Ohio Valley to expel the French, the fighting ensued. After 2 years, war was declared between France and Britain. Which side the tribes would fight for ultimately depended on how much protection either side could offer, how much land they were willing to give after the war was ended. And as the war progressed, alliances changed and the chaos escalated. Eventually, the British won the war with the 1763 Treaty of Paris and gained control of all of North America east of the Mississippi River. Native Americans were not even mentioned in the treaty. The promises were broken, and the proclamation of 1763 that prohibited white expansion into Indian country did nothing, and in fact increased white expansion into the territory. In order to understand how the Indians felt about the British and the Americans during the Revolutionary War, we need to understand their experiences with each other during the 7 Years' War. The war was expensive. In order to recoup costs, the king enacted brutal new taxes on a war-torn people. Taxation and the prohibition of expansion into lands westward fanned the flames of resentment that led to the American Revolution. Once again, the native people were asked to choose sides. The Oneida Chiefs, in a speech to Governor Trumbull, expressed how perplexed they were at the war. The Oneida eventually, with the pressure of missionary Samuel Kirkland, sided with the Americans. This decision was devastating to the Iroquois Confederacy and brought great suffering to the Oneida tribe. Mary Jamison was a white woman, kidnapped by the Seneca as a teen, indoctrinated, and lived with her family as a tribal member. She described in letters chronicling her life among the Senecas how the British taunted the Six Nations to break a peace treaty they had with the whites, to join them against the Americans. They assured them that the American army was small and weak, and that the king was rich, and that if they joined them, they would never want for money or goods. Most Indian leaders wanted to remain neutral and saw the fight as a civil war, a quarrel between the king and his children. However, when they realized they could no longer remain neutral, a side had to be chosen. Joseph Brant, Mohawk leader, thought that to align with the British was to choose the lesser of two evils. Some thought that the king may regard them as subjects and treat them fairly, rather than the Americans, who saw them as savages. Even Thomas Jefferson, in his Declaration of Independence, accused the king of unleashing the merciless Indian savages on innocent women and children. No mention was made in any document of official capacity in the new government of the native assistance in the very beginnings of the country. To them, they were simply savages. The Revolutionary War severed ancient alliances and pitted grandfather against grandson. The great Iroquois Confederacy was split and deluged into their own civil war. When the war ended with the Paris Peace Treaty of 1783, once again there was no mention of the indigenous people. The treaties and promises were made, were broken, and never honored by the Americans. The legacy of the American Revolution is one of calamity, death, and destruction. In order to fulfill the God-given right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, colonial expansionism was encouraged, and in fact, it was a duty ordained by God. The new republic and its ideals had no place for the native way of life. After the war, the government was in a full-on battle to portray the native people as savages, with gruesome cartoons, engravings, and paintings, in an effort to annihilate their way of life and take their lands. It would be difficult to dismiss or even give heed to any kind of bias of the primary sources used here. In fact, in reading them, I was surprised at how polite the tone was given, even in light of the experiences these native chiefs had with their audience. Perhaps this is part of their legacy, one of true nobility in the face of such evil.